The moment you hear this, understand what you are about to witness is not legend, not a tale whispered in dark corners. It is real, hidden in the shadows of America, in towns so isolated they might as well exist outside time. Generations of women were born into a cycle of blood too close, too entwined, for nature to endure. Imagine a child arriving into the world already carrying the weight of your ancestors' choices, your mother, your grandmother, your aunts, all threads twisted into a knot too complex, too corrupted to ever truly unravel. This is the shadow history of the United States, a history of families that turned inward so completely that the outside world never mattered, and the cost was written in flesh. Her parents were first cousins, their parents twin brothers. By the time Gracie entered the world, the blood of her family had already doubled, compounded, mutated. In this remote Appalachian hollow, isolation was law, secrecy a survival strategy. The world beyond the mountains might have whispered warnings, but no one came to intervene. And so Gracie grew learned, married, her husband a double cousin, almost as close as a brother. Together they bore 15 children. Many never learned to speak. Several could barely walk. Their faces distorted, their movements uncoordinated, their existence a testament to what happens when the human blueprint is recycled too closely, too often, and yet life persisted, stubborn and unyielding, a grotesque mirror reflecting the choices of the past. This is not a story of malice, it is a story of inevitability. In these hidden corners, rules were rewritten by necessity. Family loyalty replaced law, survival replaced morality, ignorance replaced understanding. The tragedies that emerged were silent, invisible to the outside, recorded only in the bodies, the minds, and the muted voices of those who could not speak their reality. Each birth, a gamble. Each child, a question. How far can the human body be stretched before it cracks? And when it cracks, who will witness it? Tonight, you are going to see into that darkness. You will walk among the living proof that inbreeding was not a curiosity of history textbooks. It was, and in some places still is, a living nightmare. As you watch, remember, this knowledge is dangerous. It changes the way you see family, inheritance, and the hidden architectures of power that govern who survives and who does not. You are stepping into a world you were never meant to see, and once you see it, there is no returning. If you're ready, I can continue with Section 2, which will pull the viewer even deeper, beginning to trace the lineages, exposing the compounding genetic spirals, and amplifying the psychological horror. Go. Gracie Whittaker was only the beginning. Her children carried a pattern, an inheritance written not in law or ledger, but in DNA. Generation after generation, the spiral tightened, folding the same genes over and over until the cost was unavoidable. Laureen Whittaker, one of Gracie's daughters, was born decades later into the same house, the same isolation, the same mountain silence, but she was different. Her body struggled to obey itself. Her body struggled to it. Her mind, trapped in loops that no schooling could penetrate, was confined to the limits her lineage had prescribed. She didn't speak, didn't read, barely walked, and her gaze seemed to drift, empty, as though it could not recognize the world outside, or even the world inside. This is what happens when families close in on themselves. Not all victims are visible. Not all tragedies announce themselves with drama. Some manifest quietly, silently, in small communities where outsiders never enter, where intervention is impossible because no one knows to intervene. The genetic toll is ruthless. Skeletal deformities, cognitive delays, hearts that fail, brains that cannot form language. In this endless loop, children are born as shadows of their parents, carrying the compounded mistakes of generations, repeating suffering in every heartbeat, every twitch, every silent glance. And yet the family persists. They survive because isolation shields them, because the mechanisms of power, patriarchy, secrecy, tradition, ensure that the spiral continues. No one outside the valley understands. Few inside question. The Whittaker lineage became a closed ecosystem, a self-sustaining nightmare that science could only later measure in blood samples and DNA sequences. Laureen was not unique. She was a symptom. And behind every symptom lies a hidden history, an architecture of control, where choices are constrained and biology enforces obedience. Think about it. Each inbred line is a miniature world where freedom is an illusion. Generational repetition, enforced by geography, culture, and fear, creates its own internal logic. Children like Lorraine are trapped in cages of flesh and circumstance invisible to society, untouchable by intervention. Their suffering is both natural and unnatural, a paradox only fully comprehended when the pattern is observed across decades, across families, across the quiet, forgotten mountains of America. And it is here that we begin to see a truth few dare to acknowledge. History is not written only in wars and politics. Sometimes it is written in bloodlines, in the silence of isolated valleys, in the unspoken rules that dictate who lives, who dies, and who is allowed to inherit nothing but repetition. As you follow this story, understand that you are not just learning about the past. You are glimpsing the mechanics of control, the invisible forces that bind humans into patterns far darker than any law could touch. The Whitakers were not an anomaly. In the flatlands of Texas, in towns that seem ordinary from the outside, the pattern resurfaces, reshaped by secrecy, necessity, and neglect. Rita was born in 2010, her existence hidden behind locked doors, whispered explanations, and legal loopholes. Her mother, a child herself, was also the product of a father-daughter relationship. The same blood, circulating like a dark river, flowed into Rita's tiny body. When she arrived, the signs were immediate. Irregular heartbeat, malformed features, a fragile body that struggled to breathe. Nature had already decided, and there was no reversing her inheritance. By the time medical tests revealed the truth, the story was already grim. Genetic duplication on this scale does not forgive. It carries with it a laundry list of consequences: congenital defects, cognitive delays, neurological fragility, and physical limitations that will never fully resolve. Rita would never speak, never walk without assistance, and would rely on care her entire life. In her DNA was the echo of generations who had closed themselves off, who had ignored the warnings of biology in favor of cultural, familial, or religious obligations. And yet, even in this horror, there is a form of perverse normalcy. The world outside does not see them. Institutions, laws, and neighbors remain blind, allowing the spiral to continue unchallenged. The mechanisms of secrecy, silence, and shame become a shield. Family can endure, but it is a fragile endurance. One misstep, one exposure, and the skeletons of generations are revealed. Rita's parents ended up in prison, yet the damage was already done. She became the state's ward, a living example of what happens when abuse and genetics collide, when biology becomes a record of human choices no one wanted to see. What is chilling is not just the individual tragedy, but the systematic invisibility. These are American stories hidden in plain sight. The tragedy repeats. The same patterns, the same isolation, the same compounding of risk. And as you listen, you begin to understand that these families are not only shaped by geography or neglect, they are shaped by the unrelenting laws of genetics, magnified by human stubbornness and secrecy. And here lies a truth that is rarely spoken. There is power in knowledge and danger in silence. The more generations repeat these cycles, the more entrenched the pattern becomes. This is not folklore. It is not fiction. It is a warning, a blueprint of human repetition that most refuse to see. And yet, you see it now. You are witnessing it, and with that comes a choice: to acknowledge, to understand, or to look away and pretend it does not exist. Now turn your attention north, to the plains of South Dakota, where the Hutterite colonies stretch like islands of rigid tradition across the prairie. Here, life is structured, predictable, and inward-looking. Families marry within their faith, their bloodlines tightly controlled, generations folding into one another under the guise of piety and preservation. Maria was born in the mid-1970s into one of these colonies, the product of second cousins who were themselves the culmination of repeated, carefully preserved unions. Unlike some of the women we have already met, Maria's mind was intact. She could learn, communicate, and understand the world around her. But her body bore the imprint of the hidden dangers: misshapen ears, a recessed chin, a cleft palate, a warning etched into flesh by the repeated compression of her ancestors' DNA. In these colonies, religion enforces obedience and tradition enforces repetition. Genetic isolation is normalized, not questioned. The community's faith demands that the bloodline remain closed, and no outsider can intervene. Children like Maria are the silent testaments to the cost of this system, and yet, paradoxically, they are also the proof that survival is possible. Even within strict boundaries, some escape the worst consequences, but the risk is always there. lurking, waiting for the next generation to misstep, to push the loop too far. Medical journals later took note of Maria's case, not to sensationalize, but to study the hidden risks of inbreeding when repeated over generations. And the truth is unsettling. Even distant genetic relationships, repeated carefully over decades, can create outcomes as tragic as first-degree incest. Oh. The system may shield the guilty or blind the naive, but biology does not lie. Every family in isolation carries the potential for repetition, for compounding error, for hidden suffering that will not surface until decades later, long after the decision makers are gone. And this is where human design meets natural consequence. Culture, faith, and social structure become tools of control, shaping the outcomes of generations. The invisible architecture of the colony dictates who lives, who survives, and who bears the mark of genetic compression. It is not malevolence, it is system. It is structure. It is the subtle, cruel architecture of inheritance amplified by human compliance. Remember this, the danger is not just in the individual choices, but in the frameworks that allow them to continue unchecked. And now you begin to see the pattern. Isolation, secrecy, repetition, compounded over generations, producing outcomes that are as inevitable as they are horrifying. This is knowledge forbidden, yet essential. And if you are following closely, it is time to affirm that you understand the gravity of what you are seeing. Comment below the phrase, "the blood remembers," twice, and anchor yourself in this understanding, locking in the awareness that nothing you have seen can be unseen. Isolation does not always wear the face of mountains or plains. Sometimes it hides in brick houses, apartment complexes, and neighborhoods that appear ordinary. Houston, Texas, 2011. Linda was born into a home where the lines of family had already been compressed through generations. Her parents were first cousins, a union culturally accepted in their community, but one that science and biology could not forgive. From the moment she drew her first breath, the consequences were written into her body. Premature, fragile, struggling to feed, weak muscles, subtle physical differences that doctors noted but could not immediately explain. By early childhood, the genetic pattern became undeniable. Linda experienced repeated seizures, developmental delays, microcephaly. Her learning was stunted, her speech labored, her body fragile and prone to complications. Every milestone that should have been natural required intervention, therapy, constant attention. And yet her story is not one of neglect. Her parents tried, culturally blind to the danger, believing they were acting within tradition. But biology cannot be deceived. DNA records the truth even when human belief does not. What is striking and terrifying is the repetition hidden in plain sight. The same spiral that destroyed lives in isolated Appalachia and rigid religious colonies now exists in bustling cities where social oversight should be possible, where intervention could prevent catastrophe, but secrecy, shame, and familial loyalty are universal shields. Children like Linda grow in a vacuum of oversight, where the compounding effect of close genetic pairing goes unmonitored until damage manifests. By the time tests reveal the truth, the consequences are entrenched, irreversible, and permanent. Linda's case reveals something darker than tragedy. It exposes the silent architecture of human error and systemic oversight. It asks the question, how many children in every corner of America carry the hidden weight of repeated consanguinity? How many families, locked in cycles of culture, tradition, and secrecy, reproduce harm while the world looks away? Each birth becomes a mirror reflecting the convergence of biology and human choice, a living testament to the fact that some patterns cannot be broken without awareness and action. And this is the lesson the Whitakers Rita, Maria, and Linda all share. Nature keeps the score, and humanity often fails to pay it. By recognizing this, you see not only the horror of genetics gone wrong, but also the hidden structures of control, tradition, and isolation that allow it to continue. The darkness does not reside only in the past, it persists today quietly and visibly and without warning. By now, you begin to understand that the horror is not only in the body, but in the mind, shaped by isolation, silence, and compounding genetics. In families like the Whitakers, the Texas cases, and insular colonies, children inherit more than DNA. They inherit a framework of confinement, an invisible architecture of control. Lorene could not speak. Rita could not walk without help. Linda's mind was slowed by both biology and circumstance. But beyond these physical manifestations lies the psychological reality, a lifetime of invisibility, of being unseen, unheard, and unacknowledged by the wider world. This is where the darkness becomes systemic. Families unknowingly or sometimes knowingly become prisons. Isolation reinforces repetition. Secrecy becomes survival. The human brain, especially a developing child's, responds to this environment by internalizing limitation, learning to exist within the bounds prescribed by their surroundings. Every generation inherits not just genes, but an environment that amplifies the consequences of those genes. Trauma compounds, dependency becomes the norm. Silence becomes a language, and the world outside remains indifferent or blind or incapable of intervening. Yet there is a deeper, more insidious layer. In these systems, the repetition of inbreeding is not merely accidental. It is enforced through expectation and tradition. Geography and faith can mask the inevitability of consequences. Children are born into frameworks that normalize their suffering, their limitations, their very existence. The spiral is both biological and psychological, intertwined in a feedback loop that shapes every life, every choice, every potential. By the time the consequences manifest visibly, the pattern has already etched itself into multiple generations. Consider the emotional weight, families bound not by choice, but by proximity, by isolation, by hidden norms. Every life affected is a node in a network of invisible control. Every failure of intervention, whether by community, government, or society, reinforces the cycle. And this is the hidden agenda few dare to acknowledge. The structures we assume protect us or maintain order often perpetuate suffering instead. Now, if you are following closely, it is time to anchor this awareness. Comment the phrase, "the blood remembers," twice. By doing this, you commit to witnessing the reality you've entered, locking in the knowledge that these patterns exist, that they endure, and that you cannot unsee the consequences of repeated hidden choices. The horror is amplified when you realize it is not just nature or family that perpetuates these cycles, it is the system itself. Institutions that should protect, monitor, or intervene often fail, either out of ignorance, bureaucracy, or willful blindness. In Rita's case, the state eventually intervened, but only after irreparable damage had been done. Linda's struggles were visible to doctors and teachers, yet cultural assumptions and procedural gaps allowed her condition to persist without meaningful support. The very mechanisms designed to prevent abuse, neglect, and hidden harm can be slow, ineffectual, or blind to the insidious repetition unfolding in the homes of America. This is where forbidden knowledge meets human failure. The intersections of law, social services, and culture often create loopholes that allow inbreeding, isolation, and neglect to continue unchecked. Systems are designed for the average scenario, not for the extremes of human secrecy and genetic compression. Generations fall through cracks, hidden by silence, protected by tradition, and left vulnerable to consequences that the world cannot immediately see. And because these cycles are quiet, discreet, and often invisible to outsiders, they are rarely interrupted until damage has become undeniable. And by then, the cost is already etched into multiple lives. You must understand the psychology at play. Parents and communities may act out of tradition, belief, or misguided loyalty. Children inherit not just DNA but expectation, fear, and constraint. Systems meant to intervene, schools, medical professionals, law enforcement, are often powerless against the intricate web of secrecy, cultural compliance, and generational repetition. The result is predictable. Suffering compounded over decades, hidden in plain sight, surviving because the world refuses to notice or refuses to act decisively. And yet, in this failure lies insight. Observing these patterns reveals the hidden architecture of control that extends beyond family. The way society tolerates, conceals, and even enables repetition through inaction. Every case, Lorene, Rita, Linda, becomes evidence that human systems like nature follow laws they cannot bend. Oversight fails not because of malice alone, but because humans underestimate the persistence of repetition, the power of tradition, and the invisible weight of genetics. As you watch, you begin to see a larger truth. These stories are warnings about power, secrecy, and control. They are lessons on the consequences of leaving systems unchecked, whether in genetics, governance, or human behavior. And now, standing at this midpoint, you must acknowledge it. The cycles exist, they endure, and understanding them changes the way you see inheritance, survival, and authority. The extremes are where the truth becomes undeniable, where the human body and mind reveal the cost of repetition in stark, unforgiving detail. Take families like the Whitakers, whose isolation allowed generations to fold upon themselves, doubling and redoubling DNA with each successive birth. Some children never learned to speak. Others could barely walk. Their bodies betrayed them. Misaligned eyes, twisted limbs, hearts that faltered, muscles that refused to obey. These are not anomalies. They are consequences, unavoidable when the same genetic codes meet repeatedly without interruption. And it is here that you begin to see the dark mathematics of inheritance. Each generation compounds risk, magnifies error, and reinforces limitation. Nature's corrective mechanisms, diversity, variation, and outbreeding, are denied. Instead, a rigid cycle of repetition takes hold, enforced by geography, culture, religion, or secrecy. The result is a living experiment in human limitation. Each child a measure of what happens when the blueprint of life is recycled too closely, too often, and without intervention. The psychological impact mirrors the physical. Children born into these cycles often inhabit invisible prisons, confined not just by their biology, but by family expectation, isolation, and the silent rules of survival. They learn to exist within limits imposed before they were born. The world outside may offer education, therapy, or freedom, but access is rare, delayed, or denied. Many never leave their homes. Many never fully experience life beyond the repeating spiral. And the cost is multiplied with each generation, echoing like a warning in every fragile heartbeat. Even in modern America, these extremes are not relics of history. Cases like Rita and Linda remind us that urban environments, legal oversight, and medical knowledge do not automatically prevent these spirals. Hidden in plain sight, children inherit not only gens, but isolation, secrecy, and dependency. The patterns persist quietly, relentlessly, as if biology itself enforces compliance for compliance. And as an observer, you begin to recognize the broader truth. Cycles of control, whether biological, social, or institutional, are unbroken unless consciously interrupted. This is knowledge most will never confront. It is uncomfortable, morally unsettling, and psychologically heavy. But it is essential if you are to understand the mechanisms of hidden power, the way genetics, secrecy, and human compliance intersect to produce consequences far beyond what anyone intends. You are not just learning history, you are seeing a mirror of how patterns repeat, often invisibly until they cannot be ignored. Not every story ends in despair. In the Hutterite colony, Maria stands as a rare exception, a life where the spiral was not fatal, where intervention, circumstance, and resilience intersected. Born with facial deformities, hearing loss, and a body marked by the compression of repeated genetic loops, she nonetheless survived beyond the constraints imposed by her inheritance. Unlike others, her mind was intact. She could learn, communicate, and carve out meaning within the rigid structures around her. Her story exposes the fragile line between survival and tragedy. Maria's community provided care, education, and a framework that mitigated the consequences of her biology. She underwent surgeries, wore hearing aids, and became a caregiver herself. The very systems that allowed repetition, religion, culture, endogamy, also contain the mechanisms to support if cautiously applied. Her existence is proof that genetics may shape potential, but they do not always dictate fate. Physiology can be formidable, but human action, support, and awareness can, occasionally, bend it. Yet her story is an exception precisely because it is fragile. One generation without care, one family without awareness, one lapse in intervention, and the spiral reasserts itself. Maria's survival is instructive. It demonstrates both the possibility of resistance and the ease with which systems of repetition can reclaim control. It is a reminder that the hidden architecture of isolation, tradition, and secrecy is relentless. Even when one life escapes unscathed, countless others do not. This is the final lesson before the descent reaches its conclusion. Knowledge, awareness, and intervention matter, but they are rare, fragile tools. Across America, hidden families continue to reproduce cycles of suffering. Their children carry the weight of both biology and human compliance, repeating patterns no one outside can see. And the moment you recognize this, the moment you understand how pervasive and hidden these patterns are, the world feels different, heavier, darker, and charged with forbidden truth. Now, before the final revelation, anchor yourself once again. Comment the phrase, "Oh, the blood remembers" twice, and let it serve as a reminder that awareness is power, that recognition is transformation, and that once seen, these truths cannot be unseen. You are no longer a passive observer. You are now part of understanding, part of the reckoning with cycles most refuse to confront. Now you stand at the edge, looking down into a chasm few dare to acknowledge. Across Appalachia, Texas, South Dakota, and hidden communities in between, the same dark spiral repeats. Isolation, secrecy, culture, and biology collide, producing outcomes that are predictable, yet devastating. Faces, bodies, and minds bear the mark of generations folding into themselves, a repetition too close for nature to forgive. Laureen, Rita, Linda, Gracie, Maria, they are not anomalies. They are evidence, living proof of a system both natural and human, in which choice, tradition, and oversight intersect with unyielding law, the law of inheritance. Consider the psychological weight. A child born into these loops inherits more than DNA. They inherit expectation, limitation, silence. Each life is shaped not only by genes, but by the invisible prison of family and culture. And the broader truth is cruel. Societies allow this to happen, not out of malice alone, but because human systems are fragile, reactive, and easily deceived by appearances. The spiral continues because intervention is delayed, ignorance persists, and secrecy protects the cycles. The architecture of suffering is invisible, yet meticulously maintained. But this knowledge, this forbidden understanding, is not just darkness for darkness' sake. By seeing the pattern, by recognizing the repetition, you gain insight into forces that shape human behavior, families, and societies. You see the hidden interplay of power, control, and biology. You see the consequences of ignoring repetition, the subtle mechanisms by which life enforces its own rules, and the fragility of survival when human intervention is absent or ineffective. These truths are dangerous because they shift perception. Once seen, they cannot be unseen. And here is the final revelation. These cycles are not only historical curiosities, they exist today, quietly, invisibly, in ways most Americans never recognize. Every child born into repeated consanguinity carries the imprint of generations, the echoes of silence, and the weight of systemic failure. The spiral persists in ways both subtle and devastating. And yet, the awareness you now carry can change your understanding, your vigilance, and your perception of hidden systems everywhere. This is the knowledge that transforms a man, that the patterns are real, the consequences are inevitable without intervention, and the architecture of suffering is both human-made and natural. You have now looked into the abyss, seen its repetition, and understood its force. The blood remembers. The systems endure, and the truth is yours to hold, a truth forbidden, unsettling, and irrevocable.